by Shigeru Oishia of the University of Virginia and Ed Dana of Gallup, offers an answer to the question of what is happiness? What is truly happiness? Though the study was enormous, involving nearly 140,000 people across 132 countries, it was also straightforward. A few years earlier, researchers from Gallup had asked respondents whether they were satisfied with their lives and whether they felt their lives had an important purpose or meaning. Oishii and Diner analyzed the data by country, correlating the levels of happiness and meaning with variables like wealth, rates of suicide, and other social factors. Their findings were surprising. Their findings were truly very surprising. People in wealthier nations, in wealthier regions like Scandinavia, reported being happier than those in poorer ones like sub-Saharan Africa. But when it came to meaning, it was a very different story. Wealthy places like France and Hong Kong had some of the lowest levels of meaning, whilst poor nations like Togo and Niger had amongst the highest, even though people living there were some of the unhappiest in the study. One of the most disturbing findings involved suicide rates. Wealthier nations, it turns out, had significantly higher suicide rates than poorer ones. Yes, wealthier nations had higher suicide rates than poorer ones. For example, the suicide rate of Japan, where per capita GDP was $34,000, was more than twice as high as that of Sierra Leone, where the per capita GDP was $400 only. This trend on its face didn't seem to make sense. People in wealthier countries tend to be happier, and their living conditions are especially heavenly compared to places like Sierra Leone, which is racked by endemic disease, dire poverty, and a legacy of devastating civil war. So what reason would they have to kill themselves, to commit suicide? The strange relationship between happiness and suicide has been confirmed in other research too. Happy countries like Denmark and Finland have some of the highest rates of suicide. Some social scientists believe that this is because it is particularly distressing to be unhappy in a country where so many others are happy. Imagine that. Whilst others suggest that happiness levels of these countries are being inflated because the unhappiest people are taking themselves out of the population. But Oishii and Dana's study suggests another explanation. When they crunched the numbers, they discovered a striking trend. Happiness and unhappiness do not predict suicide. Neither happiness nor unhappiness can predict suicide. The variable that did, they found, was meaning or meaningfulness, or more precisely, the lack of meaning or meaningfulness. The countries with the lowest rates of meaning, like Japan, also had some of the highest suicide rates. Why is that? Were they really happy? Were they really happy? Was the goal really meaningfulness? Is that what we really need in our lives, desire in our lives? More than this vague word happiness. The problem many of these people face is the same one the suicide man struggled with over 80 years ago when he asked the scientist Will Durant what was the reason to go on living. Though the conditions of his life were generally good, he nonetheless believed life was not worth living. Today there are millions of people who join him in that belief. 4 out of 10 Americans have not discovered a satisfying life purpose. Can you imagine? 4 out of 10 Americans have not discovered a satisfying life purpose. And nearly a quarter of Americans, about 100 million people, do not have a strong sense of what makes their lives meaningful. The solution to this problem obviously is not for the United States to become more like Sierra Leone. Modernity, though it can sap meaning of life, has its benefits. But how can people living in modern societies find fulfillment